Welcome to the Lord of the Dark. The flesh markets of Comorragh are sprawling bazaars where dark Eldar cabals, haemonculi covens, and independent slavers trade captured humans and other species as living commodities. These markets operate as the economic heart of the Dark City, where slaves are bought for labor, torture, experimentation, or to feed the Drukhari's need for suffering to sustain their souls against Slaaneish's hunger.
In the arenas of Comorragh, a human life lasts only as long as it can provide a new melody of agony for the audience.
The value of a slave depends on their capacity for prolonged suffering, with psychers and those with strong wills commanding the highest prices. When you first hear about the flesh markets of Comorragh, your mind probably conjures images of some medieval slave auction, maybe with a grimdark twist. But honestly, that comparison doesn't even begin to capture the sheer horror and complexity of what actually exists in the Dark City. We're talking about something far more ancient, far more sophisticated, and infinitely more terrifying than anything humanity has ever conceived in its darkest moments. The flesh markets represent the beating heart of Drukhari civilization, and I use that term loosely because calling what the Dark Eldar have built a civilization feels almost generous. These sprawling bazaars serve as the primary economic engine for an entire species that has built its continued existence on the systematic harvesting of suffering from other sentient beings. This isn't just commerce in the traditional sense. This is survival elevated to an art form so twisted that it makes every other slave trade in galactic history look like a children's swap meet. To understand why these markets exist at all, you have to grasp the fundamental curse that hangs over every single Drukhari soul. When Slaanesh was born from the excess and depravity of the ancient Eldari Empire, the Dark Prince claimed an eternal right to consume the souls of the Eldar race. The craft world Eldar found their solution in the Spirit Stones and the Path system, disciplining their emotions and protecting their souls through rigid self-control. The Drukhari chose a different path entirely. They discovered that by inflicting suffering on others, by drinking deep of the pain and anguish of sentient creatures, they could stave off Slaaneish's hunger. Every scream, every moment of despair, every psychic echo of torment feeds the Drukhari soul and pushes back the moment when the Dark Prince comes to collect. This biological and spiritual necessity transforms what might otherwise be simple cruelty into something far more desperate. The flesh markets aren't just about sadism for its own sake, though plenty of that exists too. They're about species-wide survival. Every slave sold in those twisted bazaars represents a battery of suffering, a resource that will keep some Drukhari alive for another day, another week, another year. The entire economy of Comorragh revolves around this single terrible truth. Now here's where things get really interesting from a lore perspective. The markets have evolved over millennia into something incredibly sophisticated. We're not talking about simple exchanges of goods for currency. The Drukhari have developed an entire valuation system based on a slave's capacity for suffering, their psychological resilience, their species' characteristics, and even their potential for being broken in entertaining ways. A human farmer might fetch a modest price for basic labor or quick consumption, but a Space Marine chapter serf with knowledge of Astartes operations could command a fortune. A captured psyker with their heightened sensitivity and the exquisite quality of their suffering represents the absolute pinnacle of slave value. The markets also serve crucial social functions beyond mere economics. They're places where cabals demonstrate their power and success through the quality and quantity of slaves they bring back from real space raids. A cabal that consistently delivers prime specimens gains prestige, attracts more warriors to its banner, and strengthens its position in the endless political maneuvering of Comorragh. Archons use the markets to reward loyal subordinates, cement alliances, and even settle disputes. The gift of a particularly valuable slave can smooth over conflicts that might otherwise erupt into open warfare in the spires. What really strikes me about the flesh markets is how they reveal the fundamental nature of Drukhari society. These are beings who were once part of the most advanced civilization the galaxy has ever known. They possessed technology that made the Imperium's greatest achievements look primitive, and yet they've channeled all that sophistication, all that ancient knowledge, into perfecting the art of making other creatures suffer. The markets aren't some necessary evil they tolerate, they celebrate them. They've built entire cultural traditions around the buying and selling of sentient beings. The purpose of the flesh markets extends beyond individual survival, too. They maintain the social order of Commorragh itself. Without a constant influx of slaves, the lower classes of Drukhari society would begin to wither and fade, their souls slowly consumed by Slaanesh. This would trigger desperation, violence, and potentially the collapse of the entire Dark City's power structures. The Archons and haemonculi who control the slave trade effectively control Comorragh itself, because they control access to the one resource every Drukhari needs to survive. The physical reality of navigating to and through the flesh markets represents a journey that would shatter most minds before they ever witnessed a single transaction. Comorragh itself exists within the webway, that impossible network of tunnels threading through dimensions, and the slave bazaars occupy some of the most ancient and twisted portions of this already incomprehensible space. We're not talking about a simple marketplace district you could map on paper. The geography here operates according to rules that mock everything we understand about physical space. The primary flesh markets sprawl across multiple sub-realms within Comorragh, each connected by portals, bridges of solidified shadow, and pathways that sometimes exist only when enough Drukhari are observing them. The largest and most infamous of these is the Sprawl of the Withered, a vast open expanse that stretches for what appears to be hundreds of kilometers in every direction, though travelers have reported walking its length in mere hours, while others have wandered for weeks without finding its edge. The architecture here defies conventional understanding because the Drukhari who built these structures weren't constrained by gravity, linear time, or any sense of mercy toward those who would try to comprehend their designs. Towering spires of black glass rise from platforms that float without visible support, their surfaces reflecting not light but somehow absorbing it and radiating a cold that has nothing to do with temperature. These spires serve as auction houses for the most valuable merchandise, their interiors spiraling upward in configurations that force visitors to climb past increasingly exclusive tiers of commerce. The higher you ascend, the more refined and horrifying the goods become, and the architecture seems designed to remind everyone of their place in the hierarchy. Lesser buyers never see the upper chambers, and the stairs themselves have been known to rearrange when someone attempts to reach a level above their station. Between these spires, the market floor spreads out in a labyrinth of stalls, cages, and display platforms that shift position according to schedules known only to the market's overseers. Vendors stake their claims using complex territorial agreements that have been negotiated over millennia, and violating another's space without proper tribute can spark conflicts that reshape entire districts. The ground itself isn't truly ground, but rather a membrane stretched over the void beneath Comorragh, and in certain areas you can see through it to the endless nothing below, where failed slaves and unwanted merchandise are occasionally dropped as a reminder of what waits for those who lose value. The lighting in the flesh markets comes from captured stars, dying suns stolen from real space and suspended in cages of psychic containment. These provide illumination that constantly shifts in color and intensity, casting everything in hues that make healthy flesh look diseased, and diseased flesh look almost appetizing by comparison. The Drukhari engineered this deliberately, creating an environment where buyers can better assess the quality of their potential purchases by how they appear under these unnatural conditions. Slaves who maintain any vitality under this light are considered hardier specimens. Acoustic architecture plays a crucial role that most visitors don't immediately recognize. The walls and structures are designed to channel sound in specific ways, ensuring that the screams from the processing areas reach every corner of the market, while simultaneously allowing whispered negotiations to remain private within certain designated zones. This creates an omnipresent soundscape of suffering that serves both practical and cultural purposes, reminding everyone present of the market's true nature while providing a constant low-level feeding for the Drukhari souls nearby. Water features appear throughout the market in mockery of more civilized bazaars, but these fountains and pools contain liquids that no sane being would call water. Some flow with refined suffering, a literal distillation of pain extracted from countless victims, which the Drukhari use both as currency and sustenance. Others contain preservative fluids where particularly valuable specimens are kept in stasis until purchase. The pools serve as gathering points where deals are finalized, their surfaces reflecting possible futures that skilled seers can read to determine whether a transaction will prove profitable. The cages themselves deserve particular attention because they represent millennia of refinement in the art of containment. Standard holding pens for bulk merchandise are constructed from bone metal alloys grown from the remains of previous slaves, creating a poetic horror where captives are imprisoned by the transformed bodies of those who came before them. More sophisticated containment units for valuable psychers or dangerous specimens utilize technology that exists partially outside normal space, preventing escape attempts that rely on any known physical or psychic principles. Temperature varies wildly throughout the market districts according to what's being sold in each area. Sections dealing in cold-adapted species maintain freezing conditions, while areas specializing in creatures from death worlds might simulate any number of hostile environments. The Drukhari themselves seem unaffected by these variations, their constitutions adapted to conditions that would kill lesser beings within minutes. This environmental diversity also serves as a sorting mechanism, as slaves who can survive the journey through multiple climate zones prove their resilience. The market's edges blur into other districts of Comorragh, transitioning through zones where the slave trade gradually gives way to other commerce. But these boundaries remain deliberately unclear, ensuring that the flesh markets can expand or contract according to supply and demand without requiring formal renegotiation of territorial limits. The power dynamics operating within the flesh markets create a web of influence so tangled and treacherous that even the most experienced traders must constantly watch their backs while simultaneously plotting against everyone around them. Understanding who actually controls these bazaars requires abandoning any simplistic notions of hierarchy, because authority here flows through channels of fear, wealth, reputation, and sheer capacity for violence in ways that shift constantly, yet somehow maintain a brutal equilibrium. At the apex of market influence sit the archons of the most powerful cabals, though they rarely dirty their hands with direct involvement in the flesh trade's daily operations. Figures like Asdrubal Vecht of the Cabal of the Black Heart cast shadows over every significant transaction without ever appearing in the market stalls themselves. Their representatives move through the bazaars with the understood authority to claim first selection on exceptional merchandise, and refusing such a representative carries consequences that extend far beyond simple commercial dispute. The great archons view the flesh markets as both resource pool and intelligence gathering ground, maintaining networks of informants among the traders to monitor the acquisitions of rival cabals. When a particularly valuable specimen enters the markets, the political maneuvering can begin before the slave even arrives, with archons leveraging favors, threats, and promises to secure their interests. The haemonculi covens constitute perhaps the most consistently active power block within the markets themselves. Ancient beings like Urian Rakarth have accumulated influence over millennia, and their representatives command immediate deference from even the most arrogant Cabalite warriors. The covens maintain permanent presences within the major bazaars, their flesh-sculpted servants and grotesque creations serving as both advertisement and warning. What makes the haemonculi particularly powerful is their dual role as both major purchasers and essential service providers. They buy vast quantities of slaves for their experiments, but they also offer services that other market participants desperately need, from regeneration treatments for injured warriors to the creation of specialized torture implements. This positions them as indispensable, and in Comorragh, being indispensable represents the closest thing to safety that exists. The merchant princes who actually operate the major trading houses occupy a fascinating middle ground in the power structure. These individuals have risen from various backgrounds, some former Cabalite warriors who proved more talented at commerce than combat, others members of minor noble houses who carved out their own domains through cunning rather than martial prowess. They control the physical infrastructure of the markets, owning the holding pens, the auction platforms, the transportation networks that move slaves through the impossible geography of the bazaars. Their wealth rivals that of minor archons, yet they must constantly navigate the demands of more powerful factions while competing viciously among themselves. The merchant prince who grows too successful inevitably attracts the predatory attention of those above, while the one who appears weak becomes prey for rivals below. Independent slavers form the most numerous but least powerful segment of the market's major players. These range from small-time raiders who captured a handful of humans during a real space incursion to specialized hunters who track specific types of prey across the galaxy. They must sell their merchandise through established channels, paying fees and tributes that significantly cut into their profits. Yet the alternative of attempting to operate outside the established structure typically ends in their own enslavement. Some independents manage to build reputations for reliably providing quality merchandise, earning slightly better terms and occasional protection from the merchant houses that value their contributions. Others remain perpetually on the margins, one bad raid away from finding themselves on the auction block rather than beside it. The witch cults maintain their own unique position within the power structure, operating as both customers and competitors. The great arenas of Comorragh consume enormous numbers of slaves as fodder for their bloody spectacles, making the cults major purchasers whose favor every trader seeks. Yet, the Wyches also conduct their own raids, capturing slaves that sometimes enter the markets through their own channels rather than the established trading houses. The succubi who lead these cults wield influence that transcends mere commercial power, their fame and martial prowess commanding respect that wealth alone cannot purchase. When a delegation from a cult like the Witch Cult of Strife enters the markets, traders compete desperately for their attention, knowing that securing a cult's regular business can elevate a merchant house to new heights of prosperity. Beneath all these major players operates an entire ecosystem of lesser figures whose collective activity keeps the markets functioning. Assessors who evaluate slave quality, transporters who move merchandise between locations, information brokers who trade in knowledge about upcoming shipments and buyer interests, enforcers who maintain what passes for order in the bazaars. All these roles and countless others create a complex economy of services surrounding the central flesh trade. These lesser players form factions of their own, sometimes rising to challenge established powers, more often serving as pawns in conflicts between their betters. The ambitious among them study the power structure obsessively, seeking any opportunity to climb higher, knowing that in Comorragh, stagnation inevitably leads to decline, and decline leads to becoming merchandise rather than merchant. The journey that brings fresh merchandise to the flesh markets begins far from Comorragh's impossible spires in the material universe where countless species live in blissful ignorance of the horrors awaiting them. Understanding how slaves actually arrive in the Dark City reveals a logistical operation of staggering complexity, one that combines military precision with opportunistic brutality in ways that have been refined over millennia of practice. Real space raids represent the primary source of fresh captives, and these operations function with a terrifying efficiency that most Imperial strategists would envy if they weren't so horrified by the results. Cabalite strike forces emerge from hidden webway portals with objectives that prioritize capture over simple destruction, though plenty of killing occurs in the process. The raiders specifically target population centers where resistance will be minimal and civilian density high, timing their attacks to coincide with moments of vulnerability. A harvest festival, a religious celebration, the aftermath of some other conflict that has already weakened defenses. These aren't random acts of violence, but carefully planned operations where every warrior knows exactly what types of captives their Archon desires and what prices those captives will fetch back home. The actual capture techniques have evolved into something approaching dark artistry over the Drukhari's impossibly long existence. Splinter weapons fire crystallized toxins designed to incapacitate rather than kill, leaving victims conscious but paralyzed while raiders efficiently bind and tag them for transport. Webway portals remain open just long enough to funnel screaming captives through before snapping shut, leaving behind only devastation and the traumatized survivors who weren't deemed valuable enough to take. The speed of these operations often means that Imperial response forces arrive to find empty streets and cooling bodies, with no trace of where thousands of citizens vanished to in the span of minutes. Transportation through the webway presents its own challenges that the Drukhari have spent millennia solving. Slaves must be kept alive but docile during journeys that might last hours or days, depending on the route taken. Specialized vessels called slave barges carry thousands of captives in conditions designed to maximize cargo capacity while maintaining enough survivors to make the trip profitable. The holds of these vessels defy comfortable description, with captives stacked in restraint systems that prevent movement, while automated systems deliver just enough sustenance to keep hearts beating. Some traders prefer chemical sedation during transport, while others believe that the terror of the journey itself begins the breaking process that makes slaves more valuable upon arrival. The webway routes used for slave transport represent closely guarded secrets that major cabals protect with lethal force. Certain paths prove safer than others, avoiding the unstable regions where reality bleeds through or the territories claimed by other factions who might intercept valuable cargo. Navigator slaves, usually broken Drukhari who have been conditioned to serve, guide vessels through the labyrinthine passages using knowledge accumulated over centuries of travel. These navigators often represent the most valuable crew members on any slaving vessel, and their deaths during transit can doom entire shipments to wandering the webway until everyone aboard perishes. Arrival at Comorragh triggers a complex processing system that sorts captives before they ever reach the market floors. Holding facilities operated by various factions receive incoming shipments and begin the initial assessment that determines where each slave will eventually be sold. The wounded receive enough medical attention to survive the auction process, though comfort remains entirely absent from these calculations. Valuable specimens get separated from common stock, with psychers in particular receiving special handling that involves immediate suppression of their abilities through technological or chemical means. The Drukhari learned long ago that an unsuppressed psyker in Commorragh risks attracting exactly the kind of warp attention that the entire city exists to avoid. The economics of capture and transport create their own competitive pressures that shape how different factions approach the slave trade. Smaller cabals might focus on quality over quantity, bringing back fewer but more valuable captives from precisely targeted raids. Larger organizations can afford the infrastructure for mass harvesting operations that flood the markets with common slaves while still securing premium specimens. Independent slavers occupy the spaces between, often purchasing captives from raiders who lack the connections to sell directly and transporting them to markets where demand currently exceeds supply. This layered system ensures that the flesh markets never lack for merchandise while creating profit opportunities at every stage of the journey from capture to final sale. The moment a slave enters the flesh markets, they become subject to an evaluation system so intricate and multifaceted that entire careers exist around the art of proper assessment. This isn't some crude appraisal where buyers simply check teeth and muscle tone like ancient human slavers might have done. The Drukhari have spent millennia perfecting methodologies for determining exactly how much suffering a given individual can provide, and that calculation involves factors that most species couldn't even conceptualize, let alone measure. Physical condition matters, but not in the way you might initially assume. A Drukhari buyer examining a potential purchase cares far less about strength or beauty in conventional terms than about durability under specific conditions. How long can this specimen survive flaying? What is their pain threshold? And more importantly, what is their capacity to remain conscious while experiencing agony that would kill lesser beings through shock alone? The haemonculi have developed instruments that can measure nerve density, calculate healing potential, and estimate how many times a body can be broken and restored before cellular degradation makes further revival impossible. These readings form the baseline of any serious evaluation, though experienced traders often trust their instincts over mechanical assessments. Psychological resilience commands premium prices that often exceed what physical attributes alone could justify. A slave who breaks mentally within the first session of torture provides only fleeting satisfaction, their screams becoming meaningless noise once the mind behind them has fled into catatonia or madness. But someone with genuine willpower, someone who fights to maintain their sense of self, even as their body is systematically destroyed, that individual represents a renewable resource of the highest quality. The Drukhari particularly prize individuals who retain hope, because hope can be crushed repeatedly, each destruction sweeter than the last. Prisoners who have survived terrible ordeals and maintained their psychological integrity often command prices that would purchase entire slave shipments of lesser specimens. Species origin plays a crucial role in establishing baseline value before individual assessment even begins. Humans remain the most common merchandise simply due to their abundance throughout the galaxy, but this ubiquity actually works against their value in most cases. An ordinary human from some backwater imperial world might sell for barely enough to cover transportation costs, their suffering too easily exhausted to warrant significant investment. Astartes, when they can be captured alive, represent the opposite extreme, their enhanced physiology and psychological conditioning making them capable of enduring torments that would instantly destroy baseline humans. The challenge of breaking a space marine, of finding the limits of what transhuman enhancement can withstand, attracts buyers willing to spend fortunes for the privilege. Eldar of any variety occupy a peculiar position in the valuation hierarchy, prized not merely for their suffering, but for the particular quality of anguish their sophisticated nervous systems can produce. Craftworld Eldar especially understand exactly what awaits them in Comorragh, their terror carrying the weight of cultural memory spanning millennia. The Drukhari seem to derive special pleasure from tormenting their cousins, perhaps because it reminds them of what they themselves have become, or perhaps simply because the suffering of their own kind resonates more deeply with their withered souls. Psychers represent the absolute pinnacle of the slave hierarchy, though dealing in them carries risks that discourage casual traders. The connection these individuals maintain with the warp makes their suffering echo through dimensions, producing sustenance of incomparable richness for those skilled enough to harvest it safely. However, that same connection means that torturing a psyker can attract attention from entities the Drukhari have spent their entire civilization trying to avoid. Only the most powerful haemonculi and the boldest archons typically deal in psychic merchandise, their facilities equipped with wards and containment measures that lesser operations couldn't afford or maintain. Age and experience factor into calculations in counterintuitive ways that confuse newcomers to the markets. Children, despite assumptions outsiders might make, often sell for less than adults because their limited life experience means they lack the complex emotional attachments that make suffering truly exquisite. An adult who has built a life, who has loved and been loved, who has accumulated memories and relationships, carries within them the capacity for losses that children simply cannot comprehend. Watching someone's world systematically destroyed requires that they first possess a world worth destroying. Professional background influences value significantly, with certain occupations commanding automatic premiums. Imperial commissars, inquisitorial agents, and other authority figures carry the delicious irony of their former power, their reduction to helpless merchandise providing satisfaction beyond mere physical torment. Priests and other religious figures offer opportunities to challenge faith itself, their spiritual convictions representing fortifications that skilled torturers can siege with exquisite patience. The auction process itself functions as theater where valuations become public knowledge, reputations rise or fall based on assessment accuracy, and the social dynamics of Comorragh society play out through competitive bidding. Experienced traders know that the price eventually paid often reflects buyer politics as much as actual slave quality, with rival cabals sometimes driving up costs simply to drain competitors' resources. The haemonculi covens occupy a position within the flesh markets that defies simple categorization as either buyer or seller, because these master flesh crafters function as both simultaneously while also serving as the indispensable infrastructure that makes the entire trade possible. When you start examining their role closely, you realize that the flesh markets as we know them simply could not exist without the haemonculi's involvement at virtually every level of operation. These ancient practitioners of fleshcraft bring something to the markets that no other faction can provide, which is the ability to transform raw merchandise into products of virtually unlimited variety. A haemonculus doesn't see a captured human the way a Cabalite warrior might. Where the warrior sees a source of suffering to be consumed or traded, the haemonculus sees raw material waiting to be sculpted into something far more valuable. Their covens maintain extensive facilities throughout the market districts, where slaves undergo modifications ranging from subtle enhancements to complete biological reconstruction. A baseline human entering such a facility might emerge as something barely recognizable, their capacity for experiencing pain amplified 100-fold through careful nerve multiplication, or their consciousness fragmented into multiple aware personalities, each capable of suffering independently. The economic implications of haemonculi involvement create ripple effects throughout the entire trading system. Covens purchase slaves at relatively standard market rates, apply their transformative arts, and then return the modified products to the market at dramatically inflated prices. A psyker who might command impressive value in their original state becomes almost priceless after haemonculi modification extends their potential suffering capacity, while preventing the mental shutdown that might otherwise limit their usefulness. These flesh crafters have perfected techniques for keeping victims conscious and aware through experiences that should destroy sanity within moments, essentially creating premium products that justify premium prices. Beyond their role as merchants, the haemonculi provide services that other market participants cannot function without. Their mastery over flesh extends to the resurrection of Drukhari themselves, and this capability grants them political leverage that transcends mere economic power. A Cabalite archon who offends a major coven might find that resurrection becomes mysteriously difficult should they meet an unfortunate end. Market traders who fail to show proper respect might discover that their personal haemonculus has suddenly become unavailable for the regenerative treatments that keep them functioning. This creates a subtle but pervasive influence that shapes how every other faction operates within the bazaars. The covens also serve as the primary source of the specialized equipment and substances that make the slave trade viable. Those preservation fields that keep merchandise fresh during transport, haemonculi technology, the neural inhibitors that prevent psychers from using their powers during auction, haemonculi design, the stimulants that revive dying slaves for final inspection, haemonculi alchemy. Without these contributions, the sophisticated trading infrastructure would collapse into something far more crude and inefficient. The covens essentially hold patents on suffering itself, licensing their innovations to other market participants in exchange for favorable treatment, rare specimens, or simply the pleasure of watching others depend upon their genius. Individual haemonculi often maintain personal presences within the flesh markets, their grotesque forms drifting through the crowds attended by racks and grotesques who serve as both assistants and advertisements for their master's skill. Watching a haemonculus shop for new subjects provides a fascinating glimpse into priorities that most minds cannot comprehend. They might pass over physically perfect specimens without a second glance, while becoming intensely interested in individuals displaying unusual psychological characteristics or rare genetic anomalies. Their purchases often seem random to outside observers, but each acquisition fits into experimental programs spanning centuries or millennia. The competition between different covens plays out partially within the market environment, with rival haemonculi attempting to secure specimens before their competitors can acquire them. Bidding wars between flesh crafters can become genuinely spectacular, with prices escalating to absurd levels as professional pride becomes entangled with practical considerations. These conflicts occasionally spill beyond economic competition into something more direct, though open violence between covens within the markets remains relatively rare due to the disruption it causes to everyone's business interests. Perhaps most disturbing is the role haemonculi play in quality assurance throughout the trading system. Disputes over merchandise condition, arguments about whether goods were accurately represented, debates over whether slaves have been tampered with before sale, all these conflicts ultimately get resolved through haemonculi examination. Their expertise in understanding flesh makes them the only parties capable of determining whether a slave's apparent defects are natural or artificially induced, whether their suffering potential has been secretly depleted, or whether they carry hidden modifications that might affect their value. This arbitration role gives covens access to information about virtually every major transaction, while reinforcing their position as indispensable participants in the entire system. The cabals represent the military and political backbone of Comorragh's slave trade, transforming the flesh markets from mere bazaars into arenas of economic warfare where fortunes rise and fall with the rhythm of real space raids. Understanding Cabalite involvement means recognizing that for these warrior organizations, the slave trade isn't simply a revenue stream, but rather the fundamental currency through which they measure power, prestige, and survival itself. Every major cabal maintains permanent presence within the flesh markets through established trading houses staffed by specialists whose entire existence revolves around maximizing returns on captured merchandise. These aren't simple merchants, but rather highly trained operatives who understand market fluctuations, buyer preferences, and the subtle art of presentation that can double a slave's value through proper staging. The competition between Cabalite trading houses creates constant pressure to innovate, whether through developing new capture techniques, establishing exclusive supply arrangements, or simply undercutting rivals through volume sales that sacrifice margins for market dominance. The economic competition between cabals plays out through the flesh markets in ways that directly influence raiding patterns across the galaxy. When a particular cabal floods the market with human slaves from a successful campaign, rival organizations might deliberately target different species to avoid price depression, or they might launch retaliatory raids against the same worlds to demonstrate that no hunting ground belongs exclusively to any single power. This competition drives the Drukhari to ever greater atrocities as each cabal strives to bring back more impressive catches than their rivals. Archons personally involve themselves in major transactions, recognizing that their presence during significant sales reinforces their cabal's reputation and intimidates competitors. When an Archon appears on the market floor to oversee the sale of particularly valuable merchandise, it sends unmistakable signals about their organization's current strength and their willingness to personally guarantee the quality of their goods. These appearances become political theater as much as commercial activity, with rival Archons sometimes arranging counter-appearances to demonstrate that they refuse to be overshadowed. The financial structures supporting Cabalite trade have evolved into sophisticated systems that would impress even the most cunning human financiers. Credit arrangements allow cabals to fund raids before they occur, with expected returns from captured slaves serving as collateral for resource loans. These arrangements create dangerous obligations because a failed raid doesn't simply mean lost warriors, but also defaulted debts that can trigger cascading financial consequences throughout a cabal's operations. Some organizations have collapsed entirely, not through military defeat, but through economic failure when ambitious raids failed to produce expected returns. Cabalite warriors themselves have personal stakes in the slave trade, as individual fighters often receive shares of captured merchandise as payment for their service. This creates internal markets within cabals, where warriors trade their allocated slaves among themselves, sometimes pooling resources to purchase more valuable specimens, or selling quickly to fund equipment upgrades for upcoming raids. The system ensures that every warrior has direct financial interest in capturing rather than killing potential slaves, shaping combat tactics in ways that prioritize taking prisoners over simple slaughter. The intelligence networks that cabals maintain regarding market conditions represent major investments, with dedicated analysts tracking price movements, buyer behaviors, and competitor activities. This information allows successful cabals to time their sales for maximum profit, holding valuable merchandise when markets are saturated and releasing inventory when demand spikes. Some cabals have been known to deliberately manipulate market conditions, perhaps by spreading rumors about upcoming shortages or by temporarily withholding supply to drive prices upward before major sales. Alliances between cabals regarding trade territories create some of the few stable relationships in Comorragh politics, though even these arrangements exist in constant tension. Two cabals might agree to divide certain real space sectors between them, avoiding the costly competition of raiding the same worlds, but such agreements require constant renegotiation as circumstances change and ambitious leaders seek advantages. The flesh markets themselves serve as neutral ground where these negotiations occur, with the understanding that open conflict within the bazaars would harm everyone's commercial interests. The younger and more aggressive cabals often attempt to establish themselves through the flesh markets, by accepting contracts that established organizations consider too dangerous or unprofitable. These desperate ventures sometimes yield spectacular successes that launch new powers into prominence, though more frequently they result in catastrophic losses that end ambitious organizations before they truly begin. The established cabals watch these newcomers carefully, sometimes offering assistance that comes with strings attached, other times simply waiting for failure to absorb the remnants into their own operations. The moment a slave changes hands in the flesh markets, their fate becomes sealed along trajectories so varied and horrifying that the initial capture almost seems merciful in retrospect. Understanding what actually happens to purchased slaves reveals the true purpose behind Comorragh's entire economic system, because every transaction ultimately serves the singular goal of extracting maximum suffering from living beings. The most common destination for purchased slaves remains the labor pools that keep Comorragh functioning as a civilization. The Dark City requires constant maintenance, construction, and manufacturing that the Drukhari themselves consider beneath their dignity, so purchased slaves find themselves assigned to work crews that toil endlessly in conditions designed to maximize both productivity and misery. These laborers might spend decades building new spires, maintaining the impossible architecture, or manufacturing goods in facilities where safety considerations simply don't exist. The Drukhari have calculated precisely how much abuse a given species can endure while remaining productive, and they push their workforce exactly to that threshold without crossing into wasteful mortality. Human slaves assigned to construction crews often survive for years, their bodies gradually breaking down under relentless labor while their spirits erode from the constant, casual cruelty inflicted by overseers who view causing pain as a pleasant diversion from boredom. Arena fodder represents another major category of slave usage, with countless purchased captives finding themselves thrust into Comorragh's gladiatorial circuits. The witch cults maintain an insatiable appetite for fresh opponents, and the arenas consume slaves at rates that would deplete most resources within weeks. Slaves destined for arena combat receive just enough training and equipment to provide entertainment without actually threatening their witch opponents, though occasionally a particularly skilled or lucky captive might survive multiple bouts and develop a following among spectators who appreciate the novelty of watching the same victim suffer repeatedly. The arenas serve dual purposes, providing both entertainment spectacle and concentrated suffering that nearby Drukhari can absorb, making gladiatorial events function almost like communal feeding rituals where entire crowds sustain themselves on the terror and pain emanating from the killing floor. Private torture collections represent the fate that most slaves dread above all others, because wealthy Drukhari maintain personal dungeons where they can pursue their artistic visions of suffering without time constraints or audience expectations. A slave purchased for a private collection might endure decades of carefully calibrated torment, their owner having invested considerable resources in keeping them alive and conscious through experiences that should kill any rational being within hours. These collectors often specialize in particular forms of suffering, developing expertise in psychological torment, physical degradation, or elaborate scenarios that combine multiple elements into symphonies of anguish that their owners savor like fine wines. The most valuable slaves sometimes pass through multiple collectors over centuries, their reputations growing as connoisseurs share notes about particularly memorable sessions. Haemonculi workshops claim a significant portion of purchased slaves for purposes that blur the line between torture and transformation. These captives become raw material for flesh-crafting experiments, their bodies reshaped into grotesque creations that might serve as artwork, weapons, or simply demonstrations of their creator's skill. Some slaves undergo modifications that preserve consciousness while removing everything recognizable about their original form, leaving aware minds trapped in bodies that no longer resemble anything natural. Others find themselves merged with multiple captives into composite beings that experience shared suffering, amplified by their forced intimacy. The haemonculi view these transformations as their highest art form, and slaves processed through their workshops often end up displayed in galleries where other Drukhari can appreciate the technical mastery involved in creating such elaborate suffering. Breeding programs consume certain slaves valued for their genetic potential, with captives selected for traits that might produce offspring capable of enhanced suffering or particular physical characteristics useful for specific purposes. Human females with certain genetic markers might spend their entire captivity producing children who are immediately separated and distributed to various buyers, while their mothers endure the psychological torment of endless reproductive cycles, combined with the knowledge that their children face fates potentially worse than their own. These programs operate with clinical efficiency, maximizing output while maintaining the emotional devastation that makes the process spiritually nourishing for their Drukhari operators. Some purchased slaves find themselves designated as sustenance slaves, existing solely to provide their owners with a convenient source of suffering whenever needed. These captives live in relative physical comfort compared to laborers or arena fodder, because their purpose requires maintaining them in good enough condition to feel pain acutely whenever their owner desires feeding. A Drukhari might keep several sustenance slaves, visiting them periodically to inflict precisely measured torment before returning to their daily activities, feeling refreshed and spiritually sustained. The entire flesh market system only makes sense when you understand the terrifying spiritual reality that drives every Drukhari to participate in what would otherwise seem like pointlessly elaborate cruelty. This isn't sadism for its own sake, though plenty of dark Eldar certainly enjoy their work. The fundamental truth underlying every transaction, every torture session, every carefully prolonged death is that the Drukhari are fighting a constant war for their very souls against a god that hungers specifically for them. Slaanesh, the Chaos, god born from the excess and depravity of the ancient Eldari Empire, maintains a perpetual claim on every Drukhari soul. Unlike their craft-world cousins who protect themselves through spirit stones and careful emotional discipline, or the Harlequins who enjoy Comorragh's protection, the Dark Eldar chose a different path entirely. They discovered that inflicting suffering on others creates a spiritual energy they can absorb, and this stolen vitality pushes back against Slaanesh's constant drain on their essence. Every moment of every day, the Dark Prince slowly siphons away their souls, and only through the pain of others can they replenish what's being taken. The mechanics of this soul preservation operate on principles that blend the metaphysical with the horrifyingly practical. When a Drukhari witnesses genuine suffering, particularly suffering they've personally caused, they absorb a portion of the victim's life essence. This isn't metaphorical or psychological. Observers can literally watch an aged Drukhari regain youth and vitality after prolonged exposure to intense agony. Wrinkles smooth away, clouded eyes brighten, and movements become fluid where moments before they were stiff with approaching death. The flesh markets exist primarily to ensure a steady supply of this spiritual sustenance, treating living beings as batteries of soul energy waiting to be drained. The quality of suffering matters enormously in this spiritual economy, which explains why the valuation systems in the markets focus so heavily on a slave's capacity for prolonged and intense anguish. A victim who dies quickly provides only a brief burst of energy, a snack rather than a meal. But someone who can endure extended torment while remaining psychologically present, fully experiencing every moment of their agony, generates far more valuable spiritual sustenance. This is why psychers command premium prices. Their heightened sensitivity means they feel everything more intensely, and their suffering resonates through the warp in ways that provide particularly nourishing energy. Haemonculi have studied these spiritual mechanics with obsessive dedication, developing techniques specifically designed to maximize soul energy extraction. They've discovered that hope actually enhances the process. A victim who believes rescue might come, or that their torment might eventually end, generates more potent suffering than one who has completely surrendered to despair. This knowledge shapes torture methodologies throughout Comorragh, with skilled practitioners carefully calibrating their approaches to maintain that delicate balance between agony and hope. The communal aspects of suffering absorption create interesting social dynamics within Drukhari society. Public spectacles of torment allow multiple observers to benefit simultaneously, though the energy apparently dilutes when shared among too many witnesses. This explains the premium placed on private torture chambers and exclusive access to high-quality slaves. A wealthy archon hosting an intimate gathering where a single exceptional victim entertains a small group provides far more spiritual benefit per attendee than massive arena spectacles where thousands watch the same deaths. Different types of suffering produce subtly different spiritual effects, creating preferences among various Drukhari factions. Physical agony provides reliable sustenance and remains the foundation of most soul preservation practices. Emotional suffering, particularly grief, betrayal, and despair, generates energy with different qualities that some Drukhari find more satisfying or more effective at rejuvenation. The most sophisticated torturers blend multiple suffering types, orchestrating experiences that assault their victims physically, emotionally, and psychologically simultaneously for maximum spiritual yield. The flesh markets have essentially industrialized what was once a more personal and haphazard process of soul preservation. In Comorragh's earliest days, individual Drukhari had to secure their own victims and conduct their own torments. The markets centralized this essential function, creating supply chains and distribution networks that ensure even relatively minor Drukhari can access sufficient suffering to maintain their existence. This democratization of soul energy access actually stabilized Comorragh society, reducing desperation-driven violence among its citizens while redirecting that predatory energy outward toward other species. If you found this exploration of Comorragh's darkest economics fascinating, consider subscribing to join us for more deep dives into the grim darkness of the far future. The dark economy's impact on real space raids and Drukhari society. The flesh markets don't simply exist as isolated bazaars where transactions happen in vacuum. They function as the gravitational center around which all of Drukhari civilization orbits, shaping everything from military strategy to social hierarchy to the very rhythm of life in Comorragh. When you trace the economic threads outward from those nightmare bazaars, you discover that virtually every aspect of dark Eldar existence connects back to the slave trade in ways both obvious and surprisingly subtle. Real space raids represent the most visible manifestation of how the flesh markets shape Drukhari behavior beyond Comorragh's boundaries. Every strike against Imperial worlds, every assault on alien colonies, every ambush of traveling vessels ultimately answers to market demands. Archons don't simply raid for glory or entertainment, though those motivations certainly play their role. They raid because the flesh markets have created specific demands that must be filled, and meeting those demands determines whether their cabals prosper or wither. When haemonculi covens announce interest in specimens from particular worlds, when wealthy patrons place orders for specific species, when market trends favor certain types of slaves, these preferences translate directly into military operations across the galaxy. The planning of raids has become inseparable from market analysis. Cabalite strategists study not just defensive capabilities of target worlds, but also the current valuations of their populations. A heavily defended planet might become worthwhile if its inhabitants command premium prices, while easier targets might be ignored if their populations have flooded the market recently. This economic calculation influences everything from timing to target selection to the specific units deployed. Which cults might be contracted for raids where live capture matters more than speed, while Scourge mercenaries handle smash-and-grab operations where quantity outweighs quality. The invisible hand of the market reaches across dimensional boundaries to direct violence with surprising precision. Competition between cabals for market share has militarized Commorragh's economy in ways that create constant pressure for escalation. When one cabal discovers a particularly profitable raiding ground, rivals will either attempt to muscle in on that territory or seek out new hunting grounds to establish their own advantages. This dynamic has pushed dark Eldar raiders into increasingly remote and dangerous regions of the galaxy, attacking species that most civilizations have never encountered. The market's hunger for novelty drives exploration and expansion, even as the Drukhari themselves remain bound to their dark city. Social mobility within Comorragh flows almost entirely through success in the flesh trade. A warrior who proves exceptional at capturing valuable slaves can rise from anonymous soldier to recognized asset, potentially even establishing their own small enterprise within the market system. Conversely, those who fail consistently find themselves sliding toward the bottom of Drukhari society, sometimes ending up as merchandise themselves. This creates a culture of desperate ambition, where everyone constantly schemes for advantage, knowing that the flesh markets will reward success and punish failure with equal enthusiasm. The stratification of Comorragh's society mirrors the valuation hierarchies of the markets themselves. Those who deal in premium merchandise, the psychers and rare species and exceptional specimens, occupy elevated social positions compared to traders who handle bulk commodities. Haemonculi covens command respect partly because their modifications can transform ordinary slaves into premium products, effectively creating value from raw material. Archons measure their status against rivals partly through the quality and quantity of slaves their cabals can command. Even witch cults derive prestige from their ability to extract maximum entertainment value from arena slaves, demonstrating mastery over the fundamental resource that sustains all Drukhari. The psychological impact of building an entire civilization around commodified suffering cannot be overstated. Every Drukhari grows up understanding that their survival depends on the pain of others, that their continued existence requires an endless supply of victims. This knowledge shapes their worldview in profound ways, normalizing cruelty to degrees that would horrify even hardened criminals in other societies. Children learn market valuations before they learn combat skills, understanding which species suffer most beautifully before they understand how to make them suffer. The flesh markets don't just trade in slaves, but also manufacture the cultural values that ensure future generations will perpetuate the system. Yet beneath the normalized horror lurks something almost tragic about how the flesh markets have trapped the Drukhari in their own system. They cannot stop raiding without facing Slaaneash's hunger. They cannot reform their economy without undermining the social structures that maintain order in Comorragh. They cannot show mercy without appearing weak to rivals who would immediately exploit any vulnerability. The dark economy has become a prison as inescapable as any cell in the lowest slave pens, binding an entire species to eternal predation, not through chains but through the logic of survival itself. The flesh markets of Comorragh stand as perhaps the most disturbing institution in a galaxy already drowning in horrors. They represent what happens when an advanced civilization dedicates all its considerable sophistication toward the refinement of suffering, creating systems so efficient at extracting pain that they become self-perpetuating engines of misery spanning dimensions. For the countless victims who pass through those nightmare bazaars, there exists no hope, no rescue, no mercy. For the Drukhari who depend upon them, there exists no alternative, no escape, no redemption. And for those of us who study the grim darkness of the far future, the flesh markets serve as a reminder that some horrors transcend simple violence, becoming instead entire economies built on the currency of screams. If you found this exploration of Commorragh's darkest commerce compelling, consider subscribing to join us for future journeys into the shadows of the 41st millennium.